NOS4A22, Book 2, Trust No One, Chapter 9, Day of Punishment. As the sun came up, Cammy had first noticed a change in the scenery of the place they were at within the dark spirit realm. Things didn't brighten, but became clearer and more distinct in detail. When this happened, the shadow beings stood out and were noticeable in the spots where they hid. Although Cammy and Stu had grown tired, panic began to set in yet again, and quickly. If they had known what they had done in a public area, though, they really would have been set into a frantic panic anyway, so it seemed to fit this time when their personalities shifted in their drug-fueled nightmare mania. Witnesses began to record what they had seen from distant apartment balconies. No one could get a good quality video, but screaming and wailing definitely could be picked up from the scathing audio, because the sound traveled well through those old alleyways, as loud screams always easily bounced off those old, dilapidated brick walls and shitty buildings. People screaming in mourning were heard saying things like, "No," and "Oh God." And this was nothing new to the people of this old city, although if they had been able to really see what was happening, their terror would have been amplified by 1000% at the very least. Surely the spectators from afar could guess that people had been murdered. Some may have guessed that there had possibly been a terribly tragic accident. No one with their wildest thoughts could have foreseen what was really going on down there. Yes, there had been many terrible things to have happened in the old history of the pit, even demonic supernatural occurrences, but Lamb had never directed such a cacophony the likes of this to the old place. True, it had been an old meeting place of many different satanic sects before, throughout 2,000 years. Lost in history, buried in time, purposefully. 2,000 years ago, there were a forgotten people from the frozen lands who had traveled here as what people now today would call paganistic, but back then, they were highly regarded sorcerers and druidic priests that contained phantasmagorical power that was passed down from their forefathers of the ancient lost tribes banished from the old fallen Middle East. These were the people, as it is written in popular scripture, of the main religions to be the ones not given the promise of blessing, but the promise of the curse to their bloodline and bloodlines. And so it was. These people suffered and endured, lost and endured. They kept hold of the lost knowledge and complete story of the scapegoat that is not taught because it was purposely left out and barely mentioned in the most ancient writings and teachings within the last 2,000 years. The reason being is that the banished ones had practiced unpopular beliefs that kept them alive and thriving, yet took many lives in the process. They also sacrificed many innocent lives of women, children, and virgins. They were feared by anyone who didn't have enough power of great protection. These people did not fit in with the new age to come and had no place among the new way of life within any society of the East. They made their way west across the Atlantic and found the ancient Americas. People nowadays can be so naive, thinking there only were Native Americans as we know them to be. Surely they thrived, and this is why people know nothing of these other peoples who had come. There had been many different people from all over the world to have traveled, and people are stupid to think that the first to do it were only within the last few hundred years. Complex designs for all kinds of machines, crafts, and technological devices have had many eras come and go since the beginning of creation. Things get to a peak and society destroys themselves as the planet renews itself. Humans are always pushing the limits time and time again every few thousand years, and completely losing the history of things that would prevent them from making the same mistakes. This brings us to poor Stu and Cammy. Their journey had been preordained by the ones who took thousands of years developing a base chemical compound that would activate in their generational bloodline. Cammy and Stu were far beyond doomed than what anyone could have ever been able to trace. The ancient forefathers of their grandfathers were the ones who brought those certain gypsies over, who were the family bloodline of Stewart and Cammy. They knew they were doomed from the start, but how could they have ever known the grand scale of things on this level? Oh, poor Cammy and Stu. They never had a fucking chance. Oh, God Almighty must have killed himself 2,000 years ago or more to have let all this evil take place. But no, this wasn't true, because even the most evil ones, along with the most righteous religious people of all faiths, know that the world was given over to evil forces since day one. It never was to be known for a reason. These things that are in the story of Cammy and Stewart, their descent was to be the ultimate mockery of the ascension to heaven. Lamb had planned it for 2,000 years to bring on the destruction of all the goodness that is left on this earth. His immortal mind had swelled for 2,000 years, and this is why he and his children are seen and described as having enormous heads with small, frail bodies. They have evolved into worrying demons. They worry sleeplessly, without end, about when their time is up. Lamb keeps finding a way for Satan to continue the reign of evil domination on this earth that has always been dying since the birth of creation. Gargantuan rulers with power forgotten in ancient times have fallen to the fight, and as times have changed, the ways have changed, and how things are done. Things have went from barbaric to varied ways of mystical, majestic wizardry, to the most complex devices with such unthinkable construction and components that it would break the minds of the most highly intellectual people this world has to offer nowadays, leaving them baffled and drooling in their incomprehension. There was no way or even a path one could take that would lead to understanding in these matters. All is lost, as it always has been, for a good reason. The knowledge of these things destroys civilizations time after time, again and again. Woe to those who would further speed up this process. Lamb worked to destroy and rebuild for the sake of evil. No matter how sickeningly genius the deathless spirit creature Lamb is, he was not designed in his state of being to ever understand that his will is only meant for destruction, even ultimately himself. This was so deeply rooted within his being of existence that he couldn't possibly understand, because he was given a purpose for many thousands upon thousands of years. To understand the ways of creation is madness, even for the deathless ones, who seem to themselves as immortals as they have indeed been made gods. The gatekeeper and the keeper of time were two beings who had been silent on this matter, because their command was to be silent unless they were to destroy Lamb and bring forth the wrath of Abaddon the Destroyer before his time, thus bringing the end to their master, of the lake of fire. This would bring their own destruction, causing more chaos than what even the devil himself would care for. His kingdom is destined for burning and melting, but it is the one thing he does not want on his own time or terms. Satan actually does not want to live out all the days that the Creator God has predestined to him until the end. How strange to think that the truth is what we are not taught to believe. Yet, the truth is there if anyone opens their minds to really think about the facts that are laid out before us all. When it comes down to it, Satan always wanted to be obedient and serve his master, to live out all his days selfishly until his time comes to be thrown into the lake of fire, and not a day or even a second before his time is up. How mind-blowing is this fact? Maybe not at all to some, or even many, but that is precisely the point of this all. Most people are lost as the old knowledge is lost. The forgotten ways from forgotten times are lost upon them. Anyone who knows about the things in this book are blessed and cursed at the same time. Initially, you are cursed to read these things within this book, because this is forbidden knowledge of the damned and stories that should not be and should not be told. Curses are what turn into blessings sometimes, and this is the story of Stu and Cammy. Their lives were cursed from the start, and yet fantastically, their story can be a blessing and a warning as well. Their story can give hope to the hopeless, as one can realize the only thing in life that has any kind of importance or value or meaning: love. Your life may be doomed from the start. You may have been born without a chance, for time to never give you the chance, for time to be cruel and to dangle hope in front of your face, seemingly in reach, but never really reachable. Your dice may never roll sevens, and you may lose in life every day until you die. If you know the concept of undying love, then at least you have lived to die knowing what life is about. No matter how horrible life is designed to be from the start, as it truly is designed to be a horrible, painful thing for all to suffer and endure. Everyone has the same story told in a different way. Some, though, like Cammy and Stu, their story is just very different. Some people's stories are impossible for other people to relate to, not simply because their experiences are different, but the thought of taking the time to think about why they would and could relate terrifies them. People don't want to think of themselves as they judge the ones they disagree with or dislike, when deep down inside, they have their demons tucked away in the folds of their hideous underbelly, where they have stomached their own personal failures within their personal life experience. This fight within Cammy and Stu was a driving force that would not be there without each other. Their conjoined spirit gave life to them both, making them just strong enough to withstand and endure this utmost cruelty within mental torture. Many have suffered here in this place of the pit, but nothing like the lives of Cammy and Stu. The sun had just risen on their long day, and bloody piles of people were around them. With their bare hands, they tore through their helpless, unsuspecting victims like sleeping prey. The aftermath was horrific. So much blood and torn flesh lay all strewn about like a couple hungry lions escaped the zoo. The only difference is they didn't eat their victims. Not this time, at least. How much more horrified these victims would have been if they knew these killers were cannibals. This time, they were not eating people who were already dead. They were killing people and leaving them to the worms. Everything was so senseless in their destruction. Anyone who witnessed this massacre and survived would forever be scarred by this heinous experience, as they were only left with the question, why? This was an answer that no one would get. To receive the truth and obtain the answer this question holds as to why meant a fate worse than death by Lamb, the gatekeeper of the lake of fire and the keeper of time. The three unholies, that in which to know them meant a curse upon your flesh, your spirit, and your soul. Even still, Stuart and Cammy pressed onward because they had the key within their hearts and knew what it took to escape the second death. How tragic their lives had been, to have been done so wrong from the start of their lives all the way into the end. They knew their existence was pathetic, which makes their story all the more tragic and sadder. How incredibly sad to know your whole life was a waste, like a maggot birthed in the middle of a garbage dump. Cammy told Stu with communication through their shared heart in the spiritual dark realm that they would break free if they kept the thought of their shared love within them. Stu knew that nothing could break it, and so he was confident that no matter what they were going to go through that day and the next, that nothing was going to take away what he now had with Cammy. Nothing could break what had now been solidified between their shared spirit soul and their impenetrable hearts, which were forever one through all eternity, forever and ever. Although their hearts in the flesh were organs and could be ripped from their chests, pierced by sharp objects, and tore to shreds, nothing could separate or destroy their heart in the spiritual realm, and this was where the remainder of their lives were being led out until their flesh was no more. So they knew that on the third day they needed to make a decision as early as possible before the sun went down, to die in a way that would be by their own hands, to be spared of the second death that was running through their bloodstreams. This second day, they didn't have time to think of anything other than continuing the path that had been laid out before them. This was their day of punishment that was impossible to escape. It was designed that way to be carried out, because if they did not go through with it, then they would immediately be thrown into the lake of eternal burning, and they would melt forever as a continuing mass of liquidation. Imagine what they were shown by the gatekeeper that day when he visited them. The gatekeeper stopped as Cammy and Stu. The gatekeeper stopped Cammy and Stu to show them their future with the Keeper of Time, as they would become continuous melting masses that would rise up from the bubbles of their suffering, only to sink back down, forever burning but never dying, only to suffer in a state of incomprehensible madness that would break them each moment that much more, after they would think that they could not be broken any more than what they were, and how terribly bad they felt. Time would stop for them as the keeper of time would leave them there. The gatekeeper showed them these things and telepathically told them that he would first leave them there with the keeper of time, and then the keeper of time would leave them, never to return. This would leave them hopeless in the second death. Cammy and Stu's love for each other wouldn't allow this. They accepted their fate and began their path on their day of punishment. They didn't know if and when they would see the gatekeeper again, or if they would ever see the keeper of time again. They only wanted to get through this day, and this would give Lamb exactly what he wanted. Lamb knew after their meeting with the gatekeeper that Stuart and Cammy were about to fulfill what he had laid out for them in their constructed path of destruction. In truth, there was only one way they could go, and only specifically mapped out coordinates and turns with every move, every direction they would go. Each way they went, it was Lamb who led the way, as he had burned the way and the map of their journey deep within their subconscious minds. It was now woven in their spiritual fabric and structured with the dimensions of all time, so there was no chance of escaping or turning the other way. The same love that guaranteed the will and desired deeds of Lamb would be carried out in the same love that could potentially escape him and the second death, although that could only be achieved in the third and final day. It was going to take the strongest of effort from Stu and Cammy together after they were about to be all spent on energy and knew they would be completely drained in every essence of the word. Their spirits were dwindling, and they knew it, for each time a moment passed in the spiritual dark realm, they noticed their spirits looked more and more transparent, like the ghosts they were becoming. This meant they needed to move faster to get through their day without focusing on their loss of life and any kind of power or energy they were obviously losing. They knew all they needed to know to stay strong in their madness and in their weakness, and giving up clearly wasn't an option. So they flew through narrow paths with what looked like lit up electric lines, as if they were veins without curves but sharp angles on the floor of these tunnels that were cut out and openly exposed to the left and to the right on both sides. To visualize what they were experiencing, imagine purplish black with dark tints of blue half-pipes that were one on top of each other like tubes that had been cut down the middle and somehow floating without touching, as if magnetized to be in their original tube shape, just with a large opening all the way through down the middle. And on the floor, only on the bottom half-pipe tube, these lines like intricate paths branched out. It was almost similar to a magnified circuit board on some high-tech supercomputer, but more like a vascular system, only perfectly jagged angles instead of root-like curves or branches within this intricate branching out of lines that seemed to be lit with lightning of pure golden electricity, more golden than anything they had ever seen. The shadow people were looking at them as they flew on by through these strange slit-open dark tubes. The outsides of them looked wet, and the insides were smooth like the outside, but dry like dried organs Stu was used to seeing in the family funeral home. When he looked closely, he could see more elaborate designs like mosaic patterns on the tube ceiling. There were hexagonal-type shapes overlapping like bubbled scales of a scorched snake. Stu didn't want to think too much about it, as he kept his focus moving forward along with Cammy, as she couldn't stop making her gaze in the place where there should be faces and eyes of these shadow people. The silhouettes of these shadow people were just outside the slit tube they were traveling. They were wandering spirits who had passed throughout time and left between the lake of fire and the pit. So, Stuart and Cammy in the flesh were running and falling, constantly injuring themselves, but continued to immediately pick themselves up as they ran through the alleyways of the infamous pit. Their fate was not to end there like so many countless lost souls, not like the lives they had taken either. There are many stories of the pit, but theirs was not to end there. People threw rocks at them and bricks as they ran away. Some people were too grief-stricken, but others were infuriated with the incredible loss Stuart and Cammy had caused to their already downtrodden, homeless community. As they passed the tarped tables and makeshift side tent connected walls this community shared within their black market world, they passed some gypsies who couldn't have known they were of their blood. One of the old gypsy women at the corner of her tent stand reached out and scratched Cammy's arm as the old woman tried to hold on when she grabbed Cammy's forearm. Stuart stopped after they still ran a few steps because in the dark spiritual realm they were flying through those slit tubes. Stu went back to that old gypsy woman, and what he saw was his mother as a demonic apparition with outrageously large horns weighing her head down to the ground. In the waking world, the reality was that the old gypsy woman had been thrown to the ground over her table counter from being quickly dragged by Cammy, running so violently away and out of her grasp, breaking free. Cammy stood there, looking at her arm and crying as she saw it had been shredded in her spirit body from within the dark, spiritual dark realm. Stuart let out a barbaric roar as he flew up in the air, and the witnesses couldn't believe this his inhuman act that seemed like witchery. The old gypsy woman picked her head up at an angle that hurt her neck to look up at him coming down from this incredible jump in the air, and she screamed the word no. Stu, instead of coming down on her with all his force, controlled himself to stop and land with his shoe, hitting the old gravelly blacktop not even an inch away from her wrinkled face. She said thank you, and Stu replied, "Don't thank me, Mother. You are cursed. Look at you! The horns weigh down your head." "It's true, Stewie. I am your mother speaking to this woman, who is our relative. She is not as you see her in the spiritual realm, but you are indeed seeing my true form. I am your mother, and I am a cursed demon." The woman spoke with a voice not of her own, and yet not like the voice Stuart remembered to be his mother's. "You will be left here once we leave you now. We will leave you to wander, never to harm us again. Look what you did to her. My whole life you caused harm to me in every way, and now you reach out to harm my love from beyond the grave." Stu yelled like a drunkard, although he wasn't intoxicated on alcohol, but drunk on rage. Stuart had a boiling fever within his blood and within his brain. His blood boiled with intense rage, and his brain popped and fizzled with chemicals that destroyed his empathy. His body had succumbed to the will of Lamb through the evil that coursed through his veins, and he slapped his dark spirit vision of his demonic mother apparition that was within this old gypsy woman who was her host. Although Stewart intended to simply slap her as she tried to pick herself up from the ground, he had easily broken her neck with the force that he moved within the dark spiritual realm. The chemical compounds of the drugs within them weren't the only cause of their superhuman abilities. It was the combination of the chemicals and the actual spiritual dimension itself. The outer extra-dimensional layer they traversed and were submerged in within their spiritual bodies was a place that expanded their strength as their true outer layers within this place were revealed to them and exposed. People don't know their full potential because their whole being is invisible to the three-dimensional lens. The average eye cannot pick up or recognize the layers of our true selves. Stu and Cammy weren't visualizing their flesh bodies anymore, but they were realizing the other layers unseen as they had access to things in the nether realm. It was now well after 6 in the morning, and they had just escaped the long tubes through which they were traveling. In the flesh world, they had just left the alleyways of the pit and entered another main street.